Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. A new joint investigation by the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News reveals that since 1998, roughly 380 Southern Baptist church leaders and volunteers have faced allegations of sexual misconduct, and more of them worked in Texas than in any other state. Houston Chronicle investigative reporter John Tedesco is part of the team writing about this research into sex abuse by the Southern Baptist Church and joins me now to discuss those details. So, John, thank you for joining me again here on the In-Depth podcast. When we spoke first back in August, you were at the San Antonio Express News. You're now at our sister paper in Houston, but no matter where you are, you're still doing that same great reporting. Tell me about the team that's been assembled that you're a part of that's been putting out this new series of reports on church sexual abuse.
Well, this was a collaboration between the San Antonio Express News and the Houston Chronicle. We had three reporters working on this. Robert Downen at the Chronicle kind of came up with the story idea, and Lisa Olson, who is a veteran investigative reporter at the Chronicle, also was on the team. And both newsrooms had editors who were working on this. Steve Riley at the Chronicle, David Shepard, and Mark DeVoyson at the Express News all edited stories, and we all worked on this. There was also a data team with Jordan Rubio, Matt Dempsey. There was a lot of people that contributed to this. John Shapley was a photographer and videographer who shot some incredible footage in interviews that we did.
And so, of course, John, the big story on church sexual abuse for such a long time has been about the Catholic Church. What was it that specifically made you and your team investigate Southern Baptist churches?
Well, Rob Downen, the reporter at the Chronicle, came up with this idea. He was looking at a case of sex abuse allegations against a SBC leader, and he basically just wondered, how often does this happen in the Southern Baptist Convention? This is the largest coalition of Baptist churches in the United States, and unlike the Catholic Church, they're completely decentralized. There's no pope, there's no bishop, there's no such thing as a parish. Each church basically calls its own shots. And so we all teamed up to try to just quantify and, come up with some kind of tally to find out how often sex abuse happens at Baptist churches.
At the top of today's show, I briefly mentioned some numbers from the reporting that you've been doing. Tell me more about the figures that your team has discovered regarding claims of sexual abuse against leaders and volunteers in Southern Baptist churches and the number of victims. And tell me maybe a little bit about some of those victims. As you mentioned, there's some video, there's a lot of interviews surrounding this topic that's available online right now.
We found more than 700 victims. This is a very conservative tally. I mean, there's undoubtedly more out there, but the number we came up with was more than 700 people, mostly children, who had reported being sexually abused. This is during a 20-year span. There were about 380 total cases involving some kind of documented allegation. It might have been a criminal charge. It might have been a pastor who resigned after an allegation was made. A civil litigation that resulted in some kind of resolution. Of those, there were just over 200 people who were criminally charged and convicted or received deferred adjudication. They were sentenced, and so we for the confirmed cases of where we had convictions, we posted those cases online in a searchable database that the public can, check names for themselves and see, how many people have faced accusations in their communities, and maybe they know of somebody who that they might want to know what happened if they ever got in trouble, and they can check those names. You know, we spoke to some victims before the series ran, and after the publication of the project, we've been contacted by just scores of people. They were concerned readers, but also survivors of sex abuse have contacted us. Right before this podcast, we received an email from a young man who thanked us for the reporting. I gave him a call, and he is still grappling with what happened to him, and he was coming to terms with it. And around the same time, out comes our series, and he's glad somebody's paying attention to this. He was abused by a pastor who he trusted and his family trusted, and they let this person into their home, and the pastor had unfettered access to this person when he was a boy, and that's often how it works. They play on the trust that people give them as authority figures in a church, and they use that to their advantage.
One of the things that really sticks out about the reporting you've been doing for both the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News is that church leaders and volunteers accused of sexual abuse have been placed back into churches. Tell me about some of those instances.
Yeah, we found at least 35 cases where a pastor or a volunteer was allowed to work at a church despite having some kind of red flag in their past, such as an arrest or a conviction involving a sex offense. They were still able to find jobs at a Baptist church. Sometimes the church knew about it. Sometimes these guys slipped through a background check, and sometimes they went on to reoffend at the second place they worked. So one reason why this happens is, again, Southern Baptist churches are totally decentralized, and they may or may not check references, um, do a good job conducting a background check, um, and that's how these guys wind up slipping through the cracks.
You already mentioned some of the feedback that your team has received since the publication of the first article in this series, which we might talk about the longevity of this series later on. And that was from people who supported it. Those were people telling you about their experiences, allegations of sexual abuse from leaders and volunteers of Southern Baptist churches. I'm interested what some of those leaders and volunteers maybe have said since the publication of that first piece. What has the other side of that feedback been like?
Well, the SBC leadership has, they say they acknowledge that this is a problem. They've thanked the newspapers for bringing it to light. Um, they say they don't want to write these reports off as mainstream media criticizing the churches. They say they take this seriously. They're vowing to do something about it. What that looks like, what that reform looks like, is still unclear. Um, there had been a past proposal to create a registry of basically Baptist sex offenders, or internal database that would keep track of credible accusations against pastors, youth ministers, that kind of thing. that proposal was made back in 2007 in San Antonio at the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. The SBC looked at that, and a year later they said it wasn't feasible because of church autonomy. Every church is calling its own shots. Again, there's no pope that can, there's no bishop that can order these churches to cooperate with the registry under that interpretation. So, would a database would that proposal have a new life today? It's unclear. There's going to be more information coming out next week about where things stand with that, and we're also calling SBC leaders to try to get more details about, what reform might look like, what's actually on the table here.
The first report released on this topic mentioned that more of these accused Southern Baptist Church leaders and volunteers have worked in Texas than in any other state. Why do you think that is? Is that a reflection of, the research you were able to do, your team was able to do, the people you were able to speak with? Obviously Houston and San Antonio, two cities in Texas, or is that a trend that you think would bear out across even more data?
Well, I think part of it is just the size of Texas, but also there's a lot of Southern Baptists in Texas, so I think that does make sense. There's a lot of big churches here, but also there's not all these churches are mega churches. I mean, there's a lot of small Baptist churches that they just have maybe. It's like family-run operations, with just maybe a few dozen members, and they're encountering problems just like the big churches, So I think it's part of the fabric of Texas that there's so many Baptist churches here, and that's probably what explains those numbers.
And then finally here, you've already mentioned something coming up next week. There have been several stories published so far on this topic. How much more reporting do you think is going to come out from your team about, sexual abuse by Southern Baptist Church leaders and volunteers?
Well, we're getting a lot of tips, and we're going to be doing some follow-up stories. We have some ideas we're chasing down, and we've been approached by victims who we haven't spoken to yet, and we want to talk to them and hear them. And if they feel comfortable telling their story, we want to give them that opportunity. So there's a lot of that kind of discussion going on. The response has been overwhelming. I do want to thank the people who have responded to us. My phone has been exploding with Twitter mentions, and I've been getting tons of emails, and we've been getting phone calls, and it's been incredible. So I do want to thank the people who have responded to this. Our database, I found this out today, there are local media outlets that are using our database to find pastors who have been accused or convicted of sex crimes in their community. Anybody can do that. That our database is online, it's public, it's searchable. This is turning into a really useful resource.
And thank you to Houston Chronicle investigative reporter John Tedesco for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from ExpressNews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.